Hey, welcome back to It's Just ADHD. Today we're talking about the Diagnostic Ladder. Now, this is something, Tara, you came up with, right?
Yeah, so basically, when you get diagnosed with ADHD or autism, and I'm sure this is probably true for other conditions as well, it's a very emotional journey. And there's a lot of very common emotions that people might not realize that everybody else has felt when they were in the same stage, too. And so I wanted to just create a little bit of structure out of it and almost showcase the steps that you commonly see so that people don't feel so alone when they're having all these really big feelings around their diagnosis.
Welcome to It's Just ADHD. We're two curious ADHD coaches, and we're going deep on the how, the why, and the strategies to get through the difficult moments and how to make the best of life with ADHD. I'm John, and I've got an adult diagnosis of ADHD.
And I'm Tara, and I have a late in life ADHD diagnosis and an even later autism diagnosis. We're going to be diving headfirst into the messy and often complicated research around ADHD and autism. And we're bringing you along for the journey as we break it all down and make sense of everything.
Because sometimes it's just life.
And sometimes it's just ADHD. So before we begin, I just want to remind you that this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. It is not intended to replace professional medical care. We are not doctors. We don't claim to be. We are just a couple of nerds who find this information and this research really fascinating, and we want to discuss it, but please keep your medical decisions between you and your doctor and keep us out of it. All right, let's begin.
It's not just about the moment of receiving the diagnosis. It's the steps, the emotions, the realizations, everything that leads to it and follow it. It's not necessarily like a linear, straightforward path. The ladder is interesting because there's different steps across that journey, and it's nice to have kind of a vocabulary to put it together.
Yeah, it's definitely not a linear process, and that's something that I really wanted to showcase with this diagnostic ladder. So I've helped to get a lot of people diagnosed in my life, both friends and actually a lot of coworkers too, which can be a very delicate conversation. I think I'm like up to 15 people now. And not to brag, but I've never been wrong. Like if I've told someone you should go see your doctor, I think you have ADHD or autism, I'm always right. And so I've watched a lot of people go through this process. I think people who have these conditions kind of implicitly feel like they're different, but coming to terms with the fact that there might be a label and there's feelings of joy of like finally being able to put a name to it, but I think also feelings of grief for realizing that it wasn't just in their head, it's a thing and it's going to be a thing for the rest of their lives. There's also a huge imposter syndrome. Like if there was one thing that I hope people take away from this, it's that when you get the diagnosis and you feel imposter syndrome, join the other millions of us who've gotten diagnosed because the imposter syndrome thing is so real. When you're like, was I really honest on those tests? Did I over exaggerate? Like, do I really have memory issues? And it's like, yes, you do. You lose your keys 15 times a day. Like, you're not over exaggerating. I think everybody is so concerned about co-opting a label that isn't theirs. Even when a medical professional tells you, like, yes, you now get this label, people are like, but what if I'm the exception? So that's kind of the goal of this, is to help normalize all of those really big feelings.
Yeah, I know when I got my diagnosis, at first it made so many things make sense. And at first I was like, wait, does it really apply to me? Just like what you're saying. And then I wanted a community so bad. I wanted someone else to talk to share it with, because just talking to my psychiatrist about it wasn't really cutting it for me, which is why I was so happy that we had a chance to connect. And then creating community out of it is, I think, a big goal of what we try to do here, and it can be so beneficial in navigating that. And so just disclosing it, just letting people know that you have a diagnosis can open the door for such amazing conversations and these like really amazing moments. Once you say, hey, I have ADHD, somebody else that has that, the way they light up and brighten up and the whole tone of the conversation changes because you're on the same team now.
Totally. And I think I've had people comment before, like, Tara, you think about labels a lot. And I think for me, being autistic, it's because I need to know how to read people. And so I've learned over the years really, really well, right? But when you look away when you look down, when you don't respond to my comment. I need to understand, is it because you're using the neurotypical playbook and I've like offended you? Or is it because you're using a neurodivergent playbook and I don't need to like think anything of it? It's literally just like there's no deeper meaning to it. So I think that's maybe part of why we tend to mutually light up when we have the same diagnosis, because it's like you're using the same user's manual as I am. And so I don't have to think about the
Yeah.
rules actively. Like I can just assume that you're enough to me. Not that everybody's like the same. We're not a homogenous group, but we're cousins, you know?
We experience the world in similar ways, in that the things that are hard for us are hard in similar ways, and that's something to bond over. It like makes you feel less isolated, because when you're in other settings, whether it's school or work, the things that are hard for us, people don't understand, and that separates us. That's isolating. It feels lonely because you don't understand why things are so hard for me when everybody else doesn't seem to think this is weird or challenge or hard. And those experiences, even if Tara, you and I see two different things, hard and easy, we know what it feels like to be isolated. We know what it feels like to feel like we're different. And that alone is enough to bring us together and to know that we're in it, even if it's different.
Well, I think that's a great point, is no matter what flavor of neurodivergent you have and what type of presentation you have, that struggle and that sort of perpetual challenge is absolutely a common point. And so it does give us common ground to understand each other, even if we're struggling with different things or in
Yeah.
different ways. I also think that societally, we've created a system where people tend to doubt their diagnosis, because you see these articles all the time where it's like, ADHD is overdiagnosed, autism is overdiagnosed, what's behind the spike? And you see comments from people online where they're like, it's a made up condition. Back in my day, we just disciplined our kids, or crap like that, which is not true. It's like, no, it's genetic. The kids still existed. They're just like deeply traumatized because the world rejected them.
Yeah.
And so this diagnostic ladder is meant to combat that a little bit. And really interesting insight that I've seen a lot from the autistic community in particular, because the autistic community is very open to self-diagnosis, more so with than ADHD, because the implications of getting an autism diagnosis are a little different. Like with ADHD, if you get the diagnosis, you now have access to medication. And so there's like a tangible benefit. But when you get an autism diagnosis, it's kind of like thumbs up. And there are real downsides. Like during COVID, sometimes they were denying ventilators to autistic people and stuff like that, which
Wow.
is disgusting.
That's horrible.
So there's actual downsides to consider when thinking about whether or not to get a diagnosis. So anyway, because there's not really like a medication for autism or something like that, there's not necessarily as much benefit. People are more open to self-diagnosis, and you see comments sometimes where people are like, well, what if someone is incorrectly self-diagnosing? And the responses that I've heard that I really love are, okay, first of all, if they feel autistic-ish and it's actually something else related, what's the harm? Like if it's in a similar family, but maybe not exactly autism, if they're still deriving benefit from that label, then that's great. Nobody's really being harmed by that. And the other point is that autism and ADHD and all these labels tend to have a stigma. I would say autism more
Yeah.
so than ADHD. ADHD is almost taken too lightly, where people are like, oh, squirrel. And you're like, okay, but however, there are other things. But autism is really stigmatized, where people are like, oh, and they're terrified that their kids are going to be autistic and stuff. And so
Right.
to have such profound feelings, isolate or feeling different or whatever, such that they would take on a label like that, there probably is something going on there. And they've done studies, we can link that in the description as well, that of people who self-diagnose, I think they found 80% of the time are correct. So there's a very, very high rate of accurate self-diagnosis. And so that's why the community is more accepting of it. And so you just have to think about that. Like if someone would take on a label like that, that's so stigmatized, people don't do that lightly. People don't, sure, some people do for attention. I think that's more rare than what the media would typically portray.
Yeah. Okay. So let's get into it then. If we climb this diagnostic ladder, how much is here and how much do we have to discover?
Yeah. So we're going to take you through every step in a minute here. But basically, what you can expect is we're going to cover the whole journey. So from the very beginning, when you first hear about ADHD and autism, and you're like, those are made up. I think a lot of people start from that place simply because of the way the media discusses these conditions. You slowly become more acclimated to the existence and the validity of these conditions. And I think by the very nature of you being on this podcast and like listening to it, you're probably not on the first rung. I would assume all of our listeners
Fair,
believe in ADHD and autism.
fair assumption.
But yeah, we'll take you through kind of integrating that information, getting to the point where you have the diagnosis, the feelings during the diagnosis, and then post-diagnosis, because it's not as simple as like, I get the diagnosis, the journey has ended. There's still a lot of big feelings on the other end. And I think for a lot of us, the journey doesn't necessarily ever end. You're always learning new info that can change your self-perception. Like I think for years and years and years following, you're going to hear things and be like, oh my gosh, that's an ADHD thing. Like, I would like to think that I know an awful lot about ADHD because I spend so many hours a day thinking about it and researching it. Every once in a while, we'll learn new things. Like, I think it was probably only a year ago that I learned that ADHD is connected with a lot of physical conditions like allergies, hypermobility, stuff like that, and that there are like actual genetic links. And so I think that will just continue on for the rest of your life sometimes, as you'll pick up these little tidbits and be like, your life will continue to make more sense as these little pieces slot into place.
Absolutely. And anytime you come to terms with something or understanding something, I think it always starts from a place of denial or questioning or wondering, and then ends in a place of understanding, acceptance, and having the knowledge and awareness to be able to make it work for you and adapt rather than hiding it, being afraid of it, or not knowing why things are happening. Suddenly it becomes a very powerful way to take control of your life and what makes you different and find the things that work for you and make you stronger rather than constantly trying to adapt to a broken system.
Absolutely. I think it's so funny. One of my friends who I got diagnosed, one night he told me like, oh, people told me that when I drink 10 cups of coffee, that's like not normal and that might be ADHD. Can you believe how ridiculous that is? And so in one night I took him from, that's ridiculous, that has nothing to do with ADHD, to like, you should talk to your doctor. And so I think about
Yeah.
that, and I think everybody kind of goes through that journey of like, that's ridiculous. These traits apply to everyone. And then just
Yeah.
that total perspective shift when you realize that these things that you thought were normal and that potentially your family thought was normal, because these are genetic, right? So like
Mm-hmm.
your household treats these behaviors and traits as normal. And then realizing that not everybody has that same worldview and that same experience as you. So obviously there's going to be a lot of emotions involved when you realize that your experience is different from everybody else.
Absolutely.
Well, let's get into
Absolutely.
it.
Cool.
All right. So the first step on the ladder is when you receive information about one of these conditions and you reject it. So think about if you see a video on TikTok and it's like, here are these 5 traits that are ADHD, and they list it out and you're like, that's not ADHD. Everybody does that. Like ADHD and autism are both kind of this composition of traits that exist within humans. And so in isolation, any one of these traits is absolutely not enough to make a diagnosis. And even if you have that trait to the extreme, for both of these conditions, you have to have a minimum number of this collection of traits. And so I think it's very natural to hear about 1 or 2 symptoms and be like, this is like a horoscope. That's how I've heard some people describe it. It's like a horoscope. There's enough things that you could kind of fit it to everyone. That's the first step on the ladder. And a lot of people live on this step. A lot of neurotypicals live on this step because it makes sense, right? Like any of these traits can apply to a certain number of neurotypicals. And so they're absolutely right in saying, this trait doesn't mean that you have autism. That's true. It's when you have a lot of the traits. That's when you should see a doctor. So this is where the journey begins for neurodivergent people, is that they continue to receive the info and they still reject it, but they might internally soften to it.
So this is like step 2 on the ladder. And you start to think, okay, I've seen the videos, I've got the information, so it's possible that I've got this, but where do the labels fit in? Why would I go seek a diagnosis, and how is it going to help me? What's the purpose? So in step 2, you're softening, but you're not sure how the label helps you just yet.
And so then, this is the critical one, is step 3. You receive another little factoid. You receive the information in a way that relates to a current problem that you have. And that helps you to see the merit in the label. So maybe at work, you realize that all of the other ADHD people are approaching a problem in a particular way. You know, maybe you learn about bottom-up versus top-down thinking and techniques for how bottom-up thinkers can exist in a top-down one. For folks that don't know, bottom-up thinking is a very common thinking pattern for people with autism versus top-down thinking is very common for neurotypicals. I have to imagine, I think ADHDers are also probably more prone to bottom-up thinking. So maybe you find some info that feels directly relevant to a current problem. This phase is critical because it helps you to see how accurate labels could actually add value to your life. And so that's that piece where you start to soften to the idea of getting a diagnosis or having a label. And so this is kind of the turning point. Up until this moment, you have just kind of had this information like thrust upon you. You've seen it online, you've seen it like on social media or in news, like the USA Today or like all those news companies will sometimes run pieces on what is ADHD, and they describe it in a very shallow way, such that I think a lot of people in that phase one are like, this applies to everybody. So at this point, now that you've seen the value of a label, you start to seek out info yourself. You've softened enough to the idea that you are now looking for information. You are doing research. You are talking to your doctor in trying to learn more about whether this information applies to you and whether this label applies to you. And then you conclude the label does apply. That's the next step. So for people who do pursue like the formal diagnosis route, this would be the point where your doctor confirms like, yep, you have it. Or for people who self-diagnose, this might look like you've done 100 hours of research and you are sufficiently convinced that these traits apply to you. So real quick, let's talk about the medical diagnosis versus the self-diagnosis. The difference between the two. So a lot of people don't think that self-diagnosis is valid. However, a lot of folks within the autistic community are pretty pro self-diagnosis. Why would that be the case? Well, with ADHD, the label itself does unlock certain things. So once you get diagnosed with ADHD, now you suddenly have access to medications. Like you can take a stimulant, things like that. With autism, once you get that label, it's congrats, good luck. There's no medication, there's no treatment. It is what it is. You're autistic and you're gonna live your life autistic. And so that kind of gives you a hint, first of all, why a lot of autistic folks may not go down the formal diagnosis pathway with a doctor. Now, a lot of folks do. A lot of folks are like, it is worth it to just know conclusively whether or not this applies. But for some folks, it's like, why would I pay money to feel more confident in a thing that already feels like it fits? Because I've done a lot of research. And that's also pretty valid. There's also a lot of barriers. It can be hard to find a person who can do the diagnosis. I know in Europe and like in the UK in particular, the wait list to get a diagnosis through the public medical system is like 7 years unless you go private. And in the US, it's equally quite hard to find people who are specialized enough to be able to do a diagnosis in adults. There's a lot of barriers there. It costs a lot of money and you don't really get anything once, except for a congratulations, once you do get that diagnosis. So, why would you go the medical route? I think, in my opinion, they're both totally valid. There's kind of this misconception that people see a TikTok video and they're like, I have autism now. And like, that is not a thing. Like, I'm sure a couple people have done that, but by and large, if you are autistic and you suspect that, you do a lot of research. We're talking like hundreds of hours of research before you come to that conclusion. Because I think a lot of autistic people are very uncomfortable with applying a label before they feel very confident that it fits. So, if your friend says, hey, I did a lot of research, I'm autistic, they are not kidding. They probably did an awful lot of research. And there are studies that show that I think like 80% of people who suspect they have autism through self-diagnosis are in fact correct. There's not this epidemic of people just like applying the label to themselves. You also don't get anything out of that. Autism in particular is quite stigmatized. And so by co-opting this autism label, it's going to make life hard in a number of ways. Like there's not a huge motivation there to come out publicly and say that you're autistic when you're not.
Okay, so you are diagnosed, whether that's through your own research or through a doctor. There's a lot of big feelings that people will often feel in this space. So first of all, a lot of people feel a huge relief because it explains so much of their life. I know that was true for me. And when you get the diagnosis that fits, it's a great explanation for all the experiences you've had up to this point. But it could also be accompanied by a lot of grief. There's a kind of grieving for the self you didn't know. And this happens more often with late diagnosis in adults because when you get that diagnosis as an adult, you have an identity about yourself and how your behavior fits into that identity, whether that's positive or negative. And you might look at those traits as part of who you are.
And so there is just this grieving of like, I'm a different person than my prior perception. And then there's also a grieving of the self that can never exist. You're born with ADHD or autism and you're dying with ADHD or autism. Like they don't go away. And so I think there's kind of this grieving process as well of like, I'm never gonna not be a person with ADHD or autism. I'm never not going to be a person with these neurodevelopmental conditions. And so that's just a big pill for folks to swallow and just a huge shift in your sense of identity. There's also, for some folks, a lot of anger that you weren't spotted before, especially late diagnoses. I know I felt that personally because it's like, how did nobody notice? How different would my life have been if I had supports as a kid with these conditions? So that kind of brings you to the point of like, there are a number of parents who will sometimes be like, why would I get my kid diagnosed? What does this help with? And frankly, I would say it helps with their sense of self. Like even if functionally they're not receiving medication or they're not receiving anything else, like just knowing that you're different is helpful. Like if you get bullied, for example, almost all of us were bullied growing up if you're neurodivergent. And it can help to know why. Like, you know you're different. You know that you don't fit in with your peers perfectly. But there's almost this sense of blame when you don't have a reason to ascribe it to. Like, it's like, I'm getting bullied because something about me. And it's hard to explain this because it's not you in a moral failing. It's a neurodevelopmental condition. And so it takes away the blame.
And it can really help with those more negative labels like lazy or unmotivated, because whether or not it changes the outcome of whether or not you complete a project or how much motivation you have or how you apply yourself, it's really nice to know that it's not your fault. It's not an excuse, but it's an explanation. And it can really help with your sense of self-esteem to understand why these things are happening. And once you know that, you can start to tailor some strategies for how to address it, how to solve it.
So there's a lot of anger that you didn't have that gift of being able to understand yourself earlier, and that you may have come up with a lot of like negative perceptions of yourself before. And then another feeling that comes up for folks is recontextualization.
And so once you receive the diagnosis, you start to have this flood of memories from the past. And that might be like a little small mundane situations that you would never have thought about, but you start to reconsider them through the lens of autism or ADHD, whatever the diagnosis you have is. And you realize through all those different situations, you can start to look back at your past, and sometimes immediately after diagnosis, you get this rush of memories, like you almost have this flashback of your life. And part of that is because in order to get diagnosed, the diagnostic criteria has to look at childhood and where it's set in childhood. So a lot of times they'll ask for examples from your childhood, and with the ADHD test, they'll ask for input even from your parents, which might be kind of ironic in some ways because it's genetic. So a lot of times your parents will have it, and they might not always be the most reliable narrators because they themselves will likely have ADHD or autism, whether or not they know it. So basically, you're being asked these questions about your childhood, and you start to think about it, and you get this lens of these situations that may or may not have been troubling.
I remember I had this one memory come back about when I was in preschool. They had a little like computer lab where they would walk kids over and they would get to like practice, or I think it was a science lab, or I don't know. There was another building where they would teach a different topic. And so I was in the bathroom and they left without me. They forgot me. Most kids would freak out and panic, but I did not. There were these Legos that nobody would ever share them with me because I didn't fit in with my peers. You know, starting at like 3 years old, it's harder to fit in with your peers. And so I was just excited because I got to play with those little Legos that I had never gotten to play with before. And so the teachers, in hindsight, were like, wow, she's such a well-behaved kid. And I'm like, no, actually, that was just like a little autistic kid finally getting to like play with blocks that got, you know, someone who got excluded. Another memory that came back for me is when I was in preschool, I didn't know how to skip. And so actually one of the teachers did say that I should go get evaluated for like developmental delays. And my parents sent me there, and the person who was doing the analysis was like, your kid is fine, they're normal. Because at the time, you know, you have to keep in mind, almost 30 years ago, they didn't really know what autism looked like in young girls. Oftentimes in that era, if a young girl got diagnosed with autism, it was also because she had like a comorbid intellectual disability. So like kids with like Down syndrome, for example, would also receive the autism diagnosis, but not a lot of little girls got diagnosed back then. And so when I think back on it, there were probably motor issues present as well. Like I did the toe walking thing, but the reason I couldn't figure out how to skip is because nobody explained it to me. And so I remember another teacher took me to the side and she was like, do you know how? And she's like, you step and then you hop. Step, hop, step, hop, step, hop. And then I figured it out immediately. And so it's a lot of other kids understood it inherently, and I just needed instructions. And so in hindsight, it's like that is an autistic childhood memory that I didn't perceive that way at the time. And so when you take a memory like that, isn't something that's like inherently traumatic. Is something that it's just healing to kind of understand and be able to piece together your life using this lens and understand this is why this thing happened to me. This is why I reacted in this way. This is why other people reacted to me in this way. And so there's just a tremendous amount of value in that. So anyway, these are all these thoughts and feelings that you might feel when the label suddenly gets applied to you in a more formal way. This is a really big emotional time.
And what's interesting is immediately after that, what happens for a lot of people is they start to backslide. They get imposter syndrome. They might think that they're co-opting a label or that they've convinced themselves they have a condition they might not, and wonder if they're being a hypochondriac, wonder about the accuracy of the tests. And you might start to think, well, everybody does these things, everybody's got these things, and that could just be your perception, your perspective, your viewpoint, because you might have noticed these similar traits in your parents, because they probably have the conditions as well, or in your friend group, because a lot of times people who are neurodivergent will seek each other out and they'll find each other. And so you might be observing those very traits in other people in your life. And that could cause you to wonder how accurate a diagnosis is, or how severe, how serious it is. And so people wonder if they exaggerated, and they'll start to get self-doubt even if a doctor has confirmed it. And in addition to that imposter syndrome, people might become more aware of the behavior and they'll notice it. Sometimes that backslide comes with, okay, well, I've got the condition, so now what? What do I do, and what does this mean for me? And as you become aware of the symptoms and the traits, you start to look for validation or affirmation. And that kind of evaluation period that happens with yourself and you're comparing to others can sometimes increase the traits, the symptoms, and even that self-doubt and imposter syndrome.
And so that's one of those phases that I think is really unexpected, that people don't know is going to hit them, and then it does. And then another step is that your symptoms often get worse after diagnosis because you become acutely aware of them. And I think that one can be a bit of a catalyst to get you out of that imposter syndrome phase, because this is especially common for, I think probably more common for autism, because with ADHD, once you get the label and you get on medication, it's a little easier to accept if you take the medication and you're like, oh, stimulants make me feel calm. Stimulants allow me to do the dishes for the first time. Like I remember the first time I ever took a stimulant, I felt this sense of like it was like a little bit of euphoria, which is pretty normal for like the first time you take a stimulant. But just this like incredible sense of like calm. And then I was able to just walk over and do my dishes. And I'm like, is this what everyone feels like all the time? So I think with ADHD, with the meds, sometimes you skip over the imposter syndrome. A lot of people still do feel the imposter syndrome. The meds work the way that they're expected. You get that sense of calm. You get that sense of like, these are really helping me. And you're still like, yeah, but I'm an imposter. And by the way, even if the meds don't work for you perfectly the first time, a lot of doctors prescribe like Adderall first or stuff in the amphetamine family, which is very strong medication. Like methylphenidate is not as strong. And so the meds don't always work. Even if you do have ADHD, it's not like, yes, the meds will 100% work for you the first shot. And so it doesn't mean that you don't have ADHD if you don't necessarily relate to like the way that I'm describing the med journey. So don't let that like reinforce your imposter syndrome if you're out there listening. But for autism, you know, you're not receiving a medication. You just receive a label and it's like, good luck, have fun, hope the rest of your life goes well. And that's kind of it. And so the symptoms tend to get worse because you realize how many things, like you get the recontextualization, you get the flood of memories, you get the heightened awareness of all of these traits and symptoms, and you're like, oh my God, mind blown, but also your traits are worse. And so it's really common. Like if you look at like Reddit, for example, there are so many Reddit threads where people are like, hey, I just got diagnosed with autism and now I've gotten more autistic. And sometimes people almost be like, is this placebo effect? Like what's happening? But it's not placebo. Really, really common thing to happen just because you're aware now. Like the blinders have come off and you can see it now. And so again, I think that's a good catalyst to get you out of that imposter syndrome phase. And so finally you hit this like acceptance of like, okay, I do have this diagnosis. It applies to me and here's what I'm going to do with it. And then there's kind of this optional phase. Like I think a lot of people have the acceptance and that's the end of the road. But then there's also a lot of people who go on to this kind of continued learning phase where maybe that's why you're listening to this podcast. Like maybe you got the diagnosis years and years ago, but you just want to learn more. That's the phase that I went into as well, where it was like, there are like books written about my brain specifically, and that's pretty cool. And I would like to like learn about that. Like there's an instructions manual for me. That's really cool in my opinion. And so you kind of go into this continued learning thing, and there's so many layers to peel off. I'm not quite at a decade after diagnosis, but we're coming up there pretty soon. And there's still stuff, I'll still learn new things. And I'm constantly researching this stuff. Like I have put thousands and thousands of hours into learning about ADHD and more recently autism as well, because that one was the later, I'm still late diagnosed, but the even later diagnosis for me. And I do think that there's kind of a correlation of the people who do the continued learning and the people who integrate it into their sense of identity. So there's kind of this school of thought. Some people are like, I have ADHD, I have autism, it doesn't define me. Then there's other people that are like, it's like, I personally think of it almost like a personality type. Like I'm like, it's so intrinsically linked to my personality and the way that I perceive the world and the way that for me, it's deeply, deeply linked to my sense of identity. Of all the labels, everybody has labels that kind of apply to them. So you might be like, I am a United States citizen, I am a woman, I am a mother, I am a child, I am a spouse. Like everybody has those set of labels. One of my predominant labels, like one of my foremost labels, I think above all else, is ADHD and autistic. And so I'm on the further end of that spectrum. People fall in different places, but I do think the continued learning folks who really uncover just the layers and layers and layers of how ADHD changes everything in your life, autism changes everything, it affects every part of your life, are more likely to be the ones who integrate it into their sense of identity and beyond just having it as like a sort of a medical label, but as like a sense of self. So that's kind of that like possible last step. How does this ladder help? Well, I think it's helpful because to know where people are on that ladder. And I think this ladder isn't exclusively for people getting diagnosis. It's also for the people around them. So when you think about like a parent, they take their kid to the doctor. The doctor says, hey, I really think this kid needs to get like tested for ADHD. Sometimes you'll see parents lash out about that. They get really upset and they go, my kid doesn't have ADHD. They're just a normal kid who procrastinates a lot and doesn't have a lot of friends in school, and they daydream, but they are really able to like stay up all night and play video games. So that's how I know they can focus. They're capable of it. And my kid doesn't eat certain foods, and like the list goes on and on. And they're like, but they're not ADHD. They're just a normal kid. Those are normal kid things. It's like, yeah, a couple of those are normal kid things. But in aggregate, all of those all together in the same kid, we're getting suspicious now. Like that's kind of suspicious zone. But the parents lash out. They're angry about it. They reject it. And that's because they're not at that stage 4 where they're seeking out the info. It's because they're at that stage 1 where they are receiving the info and they're rejecting it. And so maybe they will go down this ladder. They'll start to receive the info. They'll continue to reject it. They'll start to see, hey, maybe it does help my kid to not berate them when they procrastinate on something. Like they start to see the application. Or maybe they don't. Like I think that sadly there are a lot of people who never come to terms with it either. Like if their kid may have these conditions. And again, ironically, they themselves more likely than not also have these conditions, which is why some of the traits feel so normal to them. But ideally, hopefully, they go down the rungs on this ladder and get to that stage 4 where they are the ones seeking out the information instead of having the info thrust upon them. And that's how we get to the place where people can get accurate diagnoses for their kids and help their kids. And I also think friends and family, even as a late diagnosed person, friends and family, those first couple of rungs apply to them. Like if, when I went to my friends and family, I'm like, hey, I'm autistic. Everybody was like, that absolutely not. Like you don't come off as autistic. You've always been very sociable. You do well in crowds. You do well with people, stuff like that. And part of that is because we do have this like Sheldon Cooper stereotype of what autism looks like. But they themselves needed to go down this ladder. And so, they'll ask, well, what makes you think that? And I list a couple traits and they're like, those aren't autism. Or like in the case of their family, those aren't autism. I do those too. You're like, I have news for you. It's like, again, like we said, in and of itself, that trait in isolation, not autism. In aggregate, that's more autism. When you take all these traits together, that's when it does cross over. And so they have to get to the point where they've heard enough traits and seen enough traits to where they might start to educate themselves. Their mind has to soften to it. And then they maybe will like Google an article or like read something that you sent or whatever, up until they get to the point where they accept that you do in fact have it. And they probably go through their own process of changing. Your identity has changed. And they have to then change the way that they perceive you as well. And hopefully in a happy world, their perception changes a bit and they can accommodate you better. Like they might be like, oh, like one of the big things for me, I hate bars and dancing and stuff like that. With loud bars, I get really like overwhelmed. My brain just shuts off. And for a long time, this was kind of the like sense of self. For a long time, I was like, I want to be one of those 20-somethings that goes clubbing and has fun. Why can't I be like that? And so the sense of self is like, there will never exist a version of me that can function within a bar and have fun. And so coming to terms with that, where it's like, I'm never going to be the girl that gets to go have a bunch of fun in a bar and have drinks and like hang out with my friends, because I'm just always going to feel terrible because it's so loud and I get so overstimulated and it's like, oh my God, yeah, I cannot tolerate bars or clubbing or dancing. I just will never enjoy dancing because I don't know what to do with my hands. I'm fine if someone like gives me instructions, like if, like dance lessons are fine. Freestyle dancing in a club, horrible. And so what I was getting to is, when my friends then integrate that part of me into their sense of who I am, then they can better accommodate me. So they'll realize if I'm in a bar and I'm clammed up, like they've taken me to a bar, it's not a matter of me being introverted and needing to be like coaxed out and like encouraged. It's literally just like, nope, this like, it's not gonna happen. There's not a world where I'm gonna be able to function well and have fun. And so they have to kind of come to terms with that as well. So I think that they kind of go through this process too. If this described your journey, we would love to hear it. If you're currently in one of these stages, would love to hear about that. Or if it didn't, I would love to hear how your journey was different. We love to hear stories from the community, and I think it's good for all of us to kind of gain a better understanding of these shared experiences. So please do share with us. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope that you had as much fun as we did. And John, tell us what's in store for next week.
Thanks, Tara. Join us next time when we talk about some of the terrible research that's gone into how the broader population understands autism. We try to make sense if people with autism can resist killing kittens and what it says about the society we live in. Hope to see you there.